going on, folks? Welcome back to Bois, your one-stop shop for all your energy drink reviews and performance talks. I'm Christian.
I'm Brian.
And we are the Bois. So welcome back to another episode of the show. Today, we'll go over some quick supplement news, and then we're going to do, our third or fourth installment of the Bois Book Club now? I think it's right?
Yes.
Because we did Rick Rubin's book, and then 2 Adam Grant books, and then
back to back
Adam Grant books, and now we're going episode 4. So we will get into that. So it's going to be a good one. This is long overdue. I feel like we've both had this book read, but
everyone's been we've been doing everything else but doing the one episode that we need to get done.
Yes. So we're going to get that done today. So it should be a good one. We're in Gwinnett this week, which is actually nice. So we're actually in the same time zone for once.
Convenient.
Dude, I gotta say this clubhouse, first day I saw it, I was like, I don't care what else happens this week, this is my favorite place, because they had the place stocked with these bad boys, just Monster Ultras. Got a white Monster right here. They had a few other flavors as well, but it's like, can't go wrong. For the free ski. So we're gonna bring it back to the OG days, back to what we reviewed on our first episode. Believe it or not,
the very first episode when we were even worse at this.
Yeah, what was that episode? Like 8 minutes long.
8 minutes long, and there was probably
lights
went off, mics went out, and I'll be honest with you, I think there was more bits per second than like some stand-up comedy. It was, but not everything was good, but it was fun to do, and that's when we kind of realized, hey, we're not god awful at this. We're just terrible. Yeah. And then we committed to it.
Yeah, it was funny. Like the first few, I have to go look back. I feel like the first few episodes were like
15, 20?
Yeah, like 20 minutes or less. And it was strictly energy drink reviews. It wasn't until a little bit later that we got into more of the actual talking about stuff that was hopefully actually helpful to people. Maybe this is the helpful part, but
yeah, we kind of like branched into, I know we had a conspiracy theory episode. That was like way back in the day. That might have been like episode 12.
Yeah, that was a good one.
That was back when we had the studio in my house.
I feel like we did a movies episode for some reason, didn't we?
If we didn't, we should do a movies episode. We should go. Yeah. That's a topic I think for another day, but I definitely do want to bring up eventually the best training that we see in movies.
Ooh, yeah, that could be good.
Like I would love to like throw that up there, and we could go through that stuff.
Yeah, I got some ideas in my head about that right now. So, anyways, yeah, go ahead, Brian.
But
shut my big mouth.
Shut that mouth. Shut that pretty mouth. We do have a sick deal going on. As anyone knows, Vitamin Shop treats us well. And when we go in there, people are usually pretty cool. They had a great deal. $1 drinks, Gorilla Mind and Bum. So, of course, you know that I'm having to get a couple of both. I had to get iced tea lemonade. I had to get my root beer in both. And because I know we just talked about the root beer off camera here. And then I had to get one of the best Gorilla Mind flavors. Just a very simple black cherry vanilla.
OG.
Cannot go wrong. But as we get started, dude, I will say this. It's been talked about on the show a couple of times as we get started. I like to golf. You want to talk about a good feeling on a morning round? I love a coffee on a morning round. One of these bad boys, you feel like you got an Arnold Palmer on the course, but you got caffeine in it and you're getting locked in. What are we talking about? It makes being terrible at the sport so much better. But yeah, we do have some energy drink news. Yeah. So, you want me to give a little start on this for people?
Kick it off.
I'm going to kick it off real quick. We do have a brand new flavor out from Gorilla Mind. The fruit punch flavor, which is kind of disappointing because if you look immediately to the right of it, we have all these great flavors from Gorilla Mind that are just absolutely stunning. Black cherry vanilla, red gummy fish, which you said is a pretty good one, the white frost, white gummy bear, the citrus rain, wild grape, blue raz, strawberry candy. We both know we're fans of that one. Blackberry lemonade. No. Root beer. Like, they have some of these amazing flavors, and then they tease, hey, we have a new one coming out, and then we get fruit punch. Which I think fruit punch is overdone. I think that's always been the gist of us on our show, is that that and blue raz. Blue raz you can kind of save, but fruit punch is really tough. But Gorilla Mind, you were going like banger after banger after banger. I think there was a little bit of, hey, we need to get this flavor out to say we have it. And it's so approachable and wide range that they figured they would get sales with it. My hope is that there's a couple other new flavors coming with it that'll help a ton instead of this. In other news, I did see a teaser for one of our other favorite brands. I can't confirm nor deny this is actually happening, but when going through, I saw a teaser for a Shirley Temple 7-Up flavor of Ghost Energy.
That sounds
Which
very good.
I'm all in on. I love a Shirley Temple. Those are incredible. And then the Yoo-Hoo canned protein drink from Ghost Energy, which has been teased time and time again from Ryan, from Dan at Ghost, and then Max Tuning's posted it a couple of times. I'm going to be honest with you. I've never had a Yoo-Hoo in my life. My mom wouldn't get them when I was younger. She said, no, you don't get that. Sky's the limit on expectations because I don't know if it's going to taste exactly like it or not, but it's probably going to taste pretty good as like a chocolate kind of flavor. And it's in a can. That sounds fun.
Mm-hmm. I'm also waiting for that A&W collab as well with Ghost.
September's getting closer and closer and closer. And I'm going to tell you right now, I can't wait. Ghost also has been teasing a lot with Max a new Sour Strips flavor. My assumption is it comes out on the anniversary of Sour Strips and Max's birthday, as they typically do with some of these special collabs. They do it on the, I guess, influencer, their athlete's birthday. My assumption is that's when they're going to kind of like shebang, it's here. Which, if that's the case, what flavor you think you want to see on that?
I'm not even sure.
I feel
like it's going to be something unexpected.
I kind of feel like they could go one of two ways. They might take a flavor that they've already had, but that is a Sour Strips flavor, and add that little bit of sourness to it. Maybe a sour pink lemonade. That would be pretty good. Or I think they go a little weird and do like when he did the double flavors, like the wild berry watermelon or something like that. Mm-hmm. That might be pretty good as well. So that could be exciting.
Yeah, we'll see. Should be good.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that was all the news we had. Oh, these I don't know if you saw it, but the Mr. Beast and Logan Paul are making essentially like a protein Uncrustable. I don't know what that's about. These things, when people try to recreate these like very good childhood snacks into like a protein snack, it usually goes pretty horribly, to be honest with you. Like they usually are either really damn good or they taste like shit. I'm thinking of like protein donuts, usually not great. Protein cookies, tough to do.
Not great.
Pop-Tarts, tough to do.
The Pop-Tarts are bad.
Yeah, like it's tough. Even like some of the protein bars with like candy bar-ish flavors, like some of them come out
pretty
really
bad.
Rough, so
I think we'll
That'll
have
be
to.
interesting nonetheless. But
We may have to try that one, or like I think it's Jammies is the one that's like the official like partner with the NFL now.
that's a
Um,
ridiculous name.
it's like Jammies or Jammers, something like that. Um,
Well, this one's called Lunchly Lil Sammy's, so that's not much better, I suppose. Equally as ridiculous.
oh, that's ugh, bad vibe. But I think the only one
Maybe
that's
we won't
ever,
try them.
I think we have to just for the sake of doing it. I think the only one that's ever kind of hit is like Quest chips. You know,
Yeah, Quest chips are banging. Oh,
those
dude, the macros on this aren't even like good either.
that's
Well,
like
okay,
10 grams of protein, right?
yeah, 13 protein, 31 carbs, and 14 fat, so 290 calories. It's like essentially like an Uncrustable with a little bit more protein. Like an Uncrustable is going to run you, depending on like what kind you get, like probably 250 to 320. Um,
But like, I mean, it's kind of neat that they're like a Pop Tart kind of shape.
yeah,
Also,
it's like a sandwich. It's like an Uncrustable look, but the shape is Pop Tart. So who knows?
the name just sounds like a bad SoundCloud rapper.
Little Sammy's, yeah, it does.
We got Lunchly Little Sammy coming through here. He's gonna
Yep.
he's gonna put some bars down. Although I'm looking at a cookies and cream spread flavor, and
Yeah, that one does look good.
that's kind of piqued my interest. So I think, once all the little kids run through these religiously, if we can find some, I think it might be good to try and get our hands on them. But the Mr. Beast chocolate bars were not great. We can, so the expectation's not super high. We can just kind of go from there and see, I guess.
Yes, we will.
Mm-hmm. But
Alrighty, should we get down to business?
let's get down to business.
So, the book that we read for this Bad Boys book review, this Bad Boys book club, was called Subvert, and it's a book by Dan Cleather. I had first heard of Dan Cleather by reading his book Force. He has a good amount of training books actually. He's essentially like strength coach, researcher, professor. Like he's got a pretty like varied background, but all kind of centered around like teaching, coaching. I believe he is a professor at one of the universities in the UK, one of the more prominent ones, I want to say. I can't remember. I want to say it's like St. Mary's or something like that, or in the US. So I don't really know the UK universities off the top of my head, but I know he is like a professor over there, and I don't know if he still does some coaching or not. But essentially, he's wrote some really good training books. His books on his like Force series is really good. Short reads, very like putting like more complex concepts into very like understandable terms. So when I saw this book, it kind of piqued my interest because it was a little bit different. And essentially, it's called Subvert, and the subtitle is A Philosophical Guide for the 21st Century Scientist. And throughout the book, he kind of breaks down like what he thinks is like wrong with today's like scientific process, how like science has gotten away from like what it was truly meant to be for, which is like basically just like obviously seeking truth. Like we want to use science to like ask good questions and seek the actual truth, not just to confirm our biases. And this book was good. I think I liked the first half of the book a little bit more. I feel like the second half kind of got into more of like maybe the topics just went a little bit over my head, but and it's also that I'm just not versed in like what it's like in these areas of research, like
A more academic kind of sense.
Right. Like, and I think that's a part of the reason why it was good to read it, because it kind of gives you like a little bit of a like view into a different world that can kind of have adjacent similarities to coaching. So what was your overall just like general impression of the book?
I like the fact that he's very critical of both the industry of science as well as like you said in the second half of the book, like it focuses more on the scientific method and the approach to them doing the actual research. It's not just poke hole, which is really nice. I think he kind of goes a little bit deep into some of the historical aspects of this is what happened to create this problem. This is some ideas to kind of fix it, which is really cool. The one piece that like just glues me to it, and this is something that, we all kind of think a little bit, but seeing it in writing, especially by someone who holds the title that he does and affords these issues, is like he talks about the aspect of when corporations have publicly funded research in order to gain specific knowledge, you know, there's all of that biasy that goes into the research in order to make sure it kind of fits the bill. And, it becomes less of a pure scientific approach of let me see an issue and try to solve it. And it becomes more of how do I get my name on research in order to fit the agenda? Um, like we've seen it time and time again of all these with like the Coca-Cola example where they wanted to prove that caffeine was more so for flavor than anything else. It's not an addictive piece. And I think this shows a great example that caffeine is addictive. Um, so like I thought that was really cool. I definitely agree with you that the first half of the book or part one per se is a little more interesting because it's not so isolated down into just this is what goes on in the process of the lab and setting up the research, but it's more so the entire culture of science as itself. Uh, I don't think the book would be better if you got rid of part two. It's part two is a little bit drier for sure. I don't think the book would be better. I think it needs it, but I wouldn't mind like a 3/4, 1/4 split versus like a almost near half and half.
Yeah. Yeah, one thing that I think you mentioned too that like adds a little bit more credibility to the piece is like this guy is a professor at university's PhD, so he's done research, been involved in that world. It hits a little bit different when someone like that is critical of that system versus like me or you, where it's like we're not out here
We're
doing
outsiders.
researches. Yeah, we're outsiders. We're not trying to get our articles peer reviewed and published in a good journal, stuff like that. So it's like if we say something that's critical about like that scientific process, it just doesn't hit as much as someone who's like, okay, like I've actually done this thing, but I actually think that these things are wrong with it. It just hits a little bit different, which is why I think this book kind of caught my attention and why it hopefully will, obviously, as you can like see from the stuff in the book, the stuff that he is critical of is probably going to take some time and a lot of other stuff to have any big changes in it, especially with like the funding and whatnot. Um, and I want to read a little bit of a passage from the book that kind of describes essentially like, I don't want to say, I guess you could say like somewhat of like a herd mentality. He talks about like the scientific method is basically like a form of, he calls it like a form of like indoctrination almost. So I'm just going to read directly. Passage from the book says, scientific training involves the indoctrination of the scientific method, and awards are often incumbent on scientists adhering to the rules of the game that are learned during training. Career advancement is in large part governed by supporting the status quo. Major negative consequences of this is that creativity is suppressed. I think that's a really good point of like, you see it in a lot of things too, like supporting the status quo. We've talked about the Peter Principle on the show. Will kind of like might help you get like moved up the corporate ladder pretty quickly, but a lot of times that comes at the expense of actually like pursuing your own ideas and kind of just like you're agreeing with the person who like holds your destiny in their hands in order to like kind of keep moving up. Um, and then he goes on to say, secondly, this access to the means of communication often requires behavior in accordance with the status quo. Given that scientists must disseminate their ideas in order to receive the recognition they covet, this is a pressure that is hard to resist. Thirdly, science has always been reliant on the patronage of rich benefactors who exert substantial financial control over its direction. So there you have it. He basically is like, rich people in large part control science, and or big companies that have a lot of money that can fund these studies. um, I think we can both agree that like research, especially in like a lot of areas. I mean, sports performance included, like it's very much like a more of like a privilege to be able to like research that type of stuff. Like no one's like the world's not going to fall apart if we don't do a study on, contrast training or like PAP or something like that. Obviously stuff like cancer research and things like that are a lot more pertinent to like the health of people and, the society as a whole. But it's just interesting to like think that people like devote their whole careers to like something like this, like research. And it got me like wondering like how many people go through that and don't even step back to like think about like what he just said in that passage about like how those people are kind of like controlling the game, like pulling the puppet strings, and how like you kind of almost have to support the status quo to like get recognized and like get your work published in these big journals, which is basically like how you signal that you're a good researcher. I think a lot of it, like from what I've heard and like what I read in this book, and just even I had a professor in school that told me something similar. It's like, yeah, like it's a lot about who you know and like getting published in these like few specific journals that hold like all the status and prestige, and like if you can get your name in those journals, you're a quote unquote like good scientist, good researcher, and if you can't, like you're kind of almost a nobody, which really sucks.
And then there was two other parts that they kind of coincide, but they were different points that he kind of rose. One was like the quote unquote like publish or perish type of action for researchers, where it really follows them to get onto like a hot topic, and I think mental health was the example in there of, that's like a hot topic that people will fund research to get you in there. And if you kind of step outside of that, you're probably not going to get published or funded research in order to get there in that aspect. I think we see that a lot. Like when we get to our points in, our field, how many times has creatine been researched? And everyone wants to say, well, I'm researching creatine. Like we know that, or like weight training is good for athletes. Like it's never really kind of groundbreaking research that is outside the box. It's usually very, and I hate to put it this way, but vanilla when it's published inside some of these research journals. Even just some of the basic ones that we get, that it's nothing is stepping outside the box and exploring something new. It's did the 10-week or 12-week training positively or negatively affect the hamstring versus the control group that did nothing.
Probably yes.
Yeah, like it's very safe in order to get it published, and it fits I don't want to say it fits an agenda, but it does kind of fit an agenda. There's never something that really points out, hey, this could be potentially problematic, or this could be a thing. And I don't know if that's part of the, I don't want to say grift, but part of the grift of it, of like in research right now, that it has to be XYZ or it's probably not going to get funded, or B, even if it's, and the other part that he brought up was peer review and that it's not really a good vetting process. It's more of like a diplomacy of, do they like this? And there's a lot of, ironically enough, he really points out, I think this is like a common theme between both part one and part two, that as much as, science is supposed to be objective and constantly searching for a new answer, that the subjectivity when people are involved and the more people that get involved create more issues than helping solve, even though that they were good intentioned from the beginning to get people in places to research, to do this. And then when they do it, they don't necessarily publish something that's, how many times have we read something that the fraudulence of the data was skewed? So these processes were placed there in order to prevent that. But instead, they really just kind of go through and create subject matter that caters to their tastes, or maybe some of their I don't want to say personal investments, but maybe they're personal investors in order to kind of get there.
Yeah, and he talks about null results. So essentially, like results that would contradict like the hypothesis of the researcher. So essentially, like I do a research project, and I think X is going to happen, and I get Y. Like the opposite of what I think is going to happen happens, or it's just something different. And essentially, like a lot of times, those null results are not published, and I think that's part of the reason why we end up having a lot of these very similar research studies. Like the same thing gets researched over and over and over. And also, obviously, because it's safe and it's harder to get funding for a project if it's like, it's kind of like, it's a weird paradox. It's like, if it hasn't been researched before, like we should probably like look into it because there's like unknown things that we could know. But it's also hard to get funding for things that haven't been researched before because there's no evidence that it's like worth looking into. And that's kind of like you can follow that circle around to infinity. But I think that's why he's like they need to be publishing these null results so people don't just needlessly repeat the same exact experiments over and over again, just to say that they're like doing something. And a lot of times, I think that publisher perish concept, you can kind of like relate it back to just like general productivity. It's like I liken it to the difference between like being busy versus being like productive. Essentially. Yeah, like a scientist is like, okay, I just need to publish the next paper, and they're always thinking about that instead of actually like taking their time and digging into something that's actually going to be unearth a new topic or unearth a new fact, because they feel like they need to publish X amount of papers per year. And it's tough because that gets rewarded. So it's like a positive feedback loop to keep doing the busy thing instead of the productive thing.
Which is weird that, in a sense, like when he talks about this, like some of these aspects are like I keep going back to this, but they are completely off of where they're intended to be. And I just find that so odd, you know? Like there's no reason that if you wanted really good research and your intention was to have the best results or find out the true answer to anything, wouldn't you want somebody completely devoted to that process, much less, hey, we just want you to continuously publish over and over and over again, because that's how they kind of make their living into the, and he points this problem out too, of like the career researchers, where that's all they do. So like that's their lifeline. That's how they make their money. That's how they do this. That creates this new problem where instead of having two projects that they are absolutely in love with, they're just churning out, for lack of a better term, mediocre research in order to accomplish that and get that out the door. I think that's, that starts to make you kind of think like, okay, how much of that is part of the actual problem too?
Yeah, I think it's definitely part of the problem. Like if you're, it's like missing the forest for the trees. Like you're so caught up in the day-to-day like zoomed in view that you're not able to like take a 10,000 foot bird's eye view and like look at where you actually want to go with your line of research or career, to be honest with you. Because like when I think about, again, not like I'm reading research day in and day out, but like there's definitely people that like I know that do like research that's more applicable to like coaches, and like I would bet that they're not just doing papers just to do papers. Like when I think of like someone like JB Morin or like Damian Harper, where it's like very applicable, and like the stuff that they publish is like, oh, like actually like I can actually like use that, versus like people that are just researching like the same thing, like, oh, like accentuated eccentric back squat effects after 8 weeks, and do that 30 times and publish another paper. But yeah, I think it's definitely part of the problem.
And then
Ano-
he does. Oh, you got something? Are
no,
we on
I
the
was just
same?
gonna. I really liked he cited. I don't know if you remember this. It was very early in the book, so I'm kind of backtracking here. But there's four norms of scientific behavior by I think it was Robert Merton, and basically it was like four things that like scientists should adhere to, these like four principles, and if they do that, like you're gonna get, your science is gonna be what it was meant to be, like seeking truth, not seeking personal agenda, and that was communism. So science belongs to everybody, which a lot of that stuff is unfortunately behind like paywalls now. And obviously, I don't know how that works. I don't know how like researchers get paid, if it's just like strict salary through like whatever the university they're working for or institute, or if it's actually like,
I think most of the time they're paid per project, and it's like
yeah, but it's
it's.
not. The pay is going to the journals though. I think.
I think it's a little bit of both. If I'm correct, it may. I do believe that. Let me see here.
Yeah, it's probably a little bit of both, but essentially science belongs
Yeah.
to everyone. So like people should have access to, science. Universalism, scientific ideas are judged based on their merit, independent of who came up with them. I think that's a really big one. Like obviously people will try to, if they know if they can get a big name researcher to even like help a little bit with their paper, like they might not even like contribute to it, but if they can at least like slap their name on it, that might help push that paper through the peer review process and into one of the prominent journals in that field. So I think that's a big one. I think that's a big one for really anybody. Like when you're judging ideas, this kind of goes back to like idea meritocracy. If you've ever read the book Principles or Creativity Inc., they talk
Mm-hmm.
about the idea, like just taking the best idea, whether it's from, the highest person on staff or the person that just started. Like the best idea is the best idea, regardless of who says it, not just not based on who said it. And then disinterestedness, scientists act for the goal of science, not to advance personal interest. I think we touched on that. And then organized skepticism. So scientific community is structured to facilitate the critical evaluation of results and ideas. So being critical of what is published and not just accepting it as gospel. Because how many times have you, that's the thing too, is you can find contradictory results pretty easily, like on the same topic. You can see, a study done that says X, and then you can see it say something completely different, the opposite of that. So he basically is like, if we follow these, we'll be in a lot better spot. But the disinterestedness is not happening because people are trying to advance their personal interest. The universalism isn't happening because the people that are, quote unquote, popular in the scientific space are the ones that are getting their papers pushed to the front. We're hiding stuff behind paywalls, so everyone in the community doesn't have access to it. And oftentimes we're not skeptical enough because we see, a big name or like an authoritative figure and just assume that they know what they're talking about and they can't be wrong. So
Mm-hmm. Just was able to find it. So they get paid through salaried positions in a couple different ways. Number one is primarily sustained by winning competitive government or private grants, which create a salary for, say, that year or that contract, quote unquote, to do that research. So essentially, it's kind of like the problem that they pose with some of like the nonprofit organizations. In the most large example is like the homeless problem in California. If you solve the problem, you don't have a job. So people will kind of subvert solving the issue in order to maintain their high paying position, to where it's not the same thing, but it's very similar or parallel to it in, well, I need to have one research plan for next year in order to make sure I have enough food on the table. So I'm going to run through this and just kind of get a big name on it, get it published, get the money, have the results speak for whatever it is, and then I can do it again next year. It's almost like instead of becoming like a true scientist, you're now a task rabbit to prove some agenda half the time, and I use like the Coca-Cola example as one of them in order to kind of do that. But the other one is like industry and corporate researchers. So essentially they're employed by for-profit companies, pharmaceutical, tech, or automotive, to show a direct result for something. which I think we see a ton of. And these companies have tons of money. They're going to pay somebody, to maybe get the gray area of their morals to publish some research. And I think that's a kind of evidenced. And I don't think he does not address it in the book, but it kind of just shows like there's not a lot of longevity studies. They're, 3-4 months, and then they spend 3-4 months cleaning the data, and then they take it and write it, and then go through the peer review process to get it out by the end of the year. They're not necessarily taking a 2 to 3 to 4 or 5 year study in order to kind of attain these results. So I think that's part of the issue too. But one that I think he does do a really good job of kind of exercising as an issue is like the credentialism and gatekeeping within the industry. Like that's very problematic in that you don't have this, you don't have this. It's almost like he shows it as an old boys club in a sense of if you're not within this, you don't matter, which is kind of what you said with the, get a big name researcher on your paper or on your study to show that it can get pushed through, because now you're validated in a sense. It has nothing to do with if the research is the best. It's just, this is a quote unquote good one who's attached to it. So now we're more likely to push that through, which in a sense, I get and I don't like. Like I understand where it makes it a little bit easier for the peer review to kind of go through of, okay, well, we know that this person does a lot of good studies. If they're on it, it's easier for us to kind of be that or have that controlled skepticism through the issues. However, as time goes on, now you're not looking as in depth at this stuff. So does that lead to skew results, or like now you've left that bandwidth of like, hey, you can make that much margin for error to now it's this, and more things get leaked out? Like how problematic do you think that's going to be in like the truest of the industry?
You can almost liken it a little bit. I'm gonna try to be fair here. Like you put references on your resume to like know like, okay, like this person who's been in the field is well known and well respected, like can vouch for my work. So in a sense, it's like that. The tough part is like one, he discusses this kind of like at length that like the peer review process, like there's not really evidence that it makes things that much better. It's not very well defined, and it leads to a lot of like dogmatic and like unreflective criticism that just kind of like stifles creativity. That's like his argument. And a lot of times like most disciplines will have pretty widely accepted rules that are going to govern these processes. And he's just like, at the end of the day, like there's no certainty that peer review is either reliable or even like adds value, because a lot of these editors are pretty likely to just defend that status quo instead of just like supporting the rebel researcher who's trying to kind of like turn the corner for their industry. And at the end of the day, like that is kind of the scary part, because those peer reviewers can kind of shut down, the work. It's tough because like the work is done on the front end. Like you do the whole study, it's done. You write the paper, and it can just not pass through the peer review process. And then if it doesn't get into those journals, it could be a fraction of the people end up seeing it, versus like if it did get into those journals. And essentially that limits information from the people. Like a good quote from the book was like, if you can control information, you can control people. So it kind of stinks because, you do the work up front and then you're just relying on, the peer reviewers to kind of like give you that stamp of approval. And a lot of times what gets the stamp of approval is the things that is kind of going with the flow and kind of like meeting that status quo, not necessarily challenging it. Which is why like a lot of times he talks about how like the process of like even becoming a scientist is super long and tedious. A lot of times it's, was it, probably like 7 to 10 years of schooling to get like a doctorate degree. So it's very long, very tedious. and it tends to weed out people that are more like creative thinkers, because it's a very like more rigid and like structured path through the academic setting, and that it tends to weed out the creative thinkers and favors people who end up conforming to the status quo. People that are very like, okay, like you say this, I do this. Like it's very. So I think in a sense, it's just another like feedback loop of you're not going to find as many people that are, especially they may enter that process like as very like creative out of the box thinkers, but if they get to the end of that process and are still like that, it's a lot less it's a lot less likely, which on the bright side is why I think you see a lot of coaches, sports performance coaches, almost like doing their own research in a sense, which is kind of like, I guess we're all really doing that. Like you run a program, you think like, hey, I think this is going to help improve vertical jump. You run a 6-8 week program, and you do your testing before, during, after, and you see what changed, and you're like, oh, that worked, or oh, it didn't work. And going back to the null results, like I think like seeing what didn't work is just as important as seeing what did work. Like that information is also valuable. I think a lot of times like it's easy to be like, oh, like I thought this was going to work and feel like shit because it didn't work, but you're still wiser for it because you know that that didn't work. And you can take that and be like, okay, I know what not to do now at least.
Kind of on part two, I know we're both a little bit bigger fans of part one, but a couple points like he made in part two, in a sense, like at surface level, they contradict each other. But when you like read deeper, I think that's like a little bit of a reoccurring theme is if you glaze through part two, much of his points are contradictory to maybe something he said prior. But as you read, you'll see that they go hand in hand as their own issue, right? And like one of them was the kind of aspect of we treat science as a very linear method, and that the scientific method is hypothesize, kind of experiment, come to the conclusion, when in reality a lot of the times it's more of like this like spatial web that he's like kind of accustomed to, and it's here and then okay, well that's not quite right, maybe we have to go back to the drawing board and look at it this way, and it's kind of hopping around. But then later on in the book he mentions there's, I can't remember, like the falsification of the hypothesis, where he talks about a researcher will do all the research and then they're going to come up with the hypothesis after, right? And on paper you look at that and you go, okay, well that's hopping around, isn't it? Kind of that kind of a deal. But in a sense you still need the traditional direction, while the kind of go back to principles over methods of the principle is to have the hypothesis and then to test and see if you were right or if you were wrong, in the sense of the hypothesis, null hypothesis. But you can't, it's almost like, do you see these researchers and they just want to, in a sense, look really smart to become this? So like they'll do the research, create the hypothesis after, be like, I knew it, I proved myself right, and then in a sense kind of like use this as a way to like prop up their intelligence to the field and become maybe like a good researcher in someone else's eyes. Is if, and maybe it's like a gold standard of the industry that we don't know about, but maybe it's like, hey, you've done 5 research I guess studies, in the sense to where you've always proved yourself right. Do you think like there's an unwritten rule of like you hit that and you become, you kind of gain passage into one of these like good research publishings?
I think so. And like if you know, like hypothesizing after, there's an acronym called harking. I couldn't remember it, so I just looked it up. But like harking, hypothesizing after the results are known, like that's a pretty big no-no. I feel like for obvious reasons. It's like the equivalent of like cheating on a test. Like
when you get the right answer and you have to make the work look like you got to it.
Yeah, exactly. It's just like trying to fit the results to like, oh yeah, this is exactly what I thought was going to happen. Yeah, I think so. Like it's easy to probably look for that. stamp of approval. I think you see this a lot with like, he talks about like statistics and like,
Mm-hmm.
he's like, most people don't enjoy statistics. In fact, I'm usually a little wary when someone is a little too into statistics, because like oftentimes like you can manipulate numbers to make it look like,
Yeah.
yeah. There's a really good book called Risk Savvy, by Gerd Gigerenzer. He talks about this a lot, like how people will not fudge numbers, but like present numbers in a different way to make them look more or less, bad, to kind of try to like fit their narrative, which is tricky because like not a lot of people, your average person like isn't going to have like a super in-depth understanding of statistics. Like even me or you, like we probably have like a decent grasp on it, but like it's not something like I'm using a ton in my day-to-day life.
Mm-hmm.
And you can, there's people that study that like statistics for years and years and have degrees in specifically that. So it's pretty easy to kind of run the average person around in circles and make them think that, you can kind of make them think whatever you want if you present the data in a certain way. So
Mm-hmm.
I think it is partly that. Obviously, people, it feels good to look smart, but on the other hand, like, wouldn't you rather get the actual truth versus just like looking smart? Because in the end, you're going to be actually smarter.
Smart.
Yeah, like
It's kind of akin to, we always talk about the Dunning-Kruger effect in like our conversations, but the people who are so dogmatic and always in their mind are right, you you start to, as you spend more time with them, you start to consider them a little bit less intelligent versus the people who kind of give you the, it depends or I don't know answer, but this is what we've typically seen. I think there's a little bit of that in academia. And I say academia in the sense of like the research and in like traditional teachings, those types of things kind of occur on that front. Um, and I think everybody wants to show you how smart they are and how sure of it versus the other aspect of, when you meet somebody who's truly intelligent and wise, they're going to say, well, it's a little bit of here and there on that front. So I think that's a big important piece. Um, and then Cleather does talk about, like you said, with like the statistics, like people will spit out numbers left and right, and it's almost like to flood the information and just make you see it as certainty because its p-value is 0.18, and it's like you said, a lot of people don't necessarily know truly what a p-value is or what it can do or the significance of it, even though it is a measure of significance.
mm-hmm.
So it's like those should be supporting factors of the evidence and very much secondary, if not tertiary, to what you're trying to communicate. But what this turns into is there's going to be, if you look at like the results aspect of a lot of research, it's just here's percentages, here's p-value, here's this, here's that, and it's just rifling the numbers at you, which he kind of goes into detail about. And it's like, are you trying to communicate something, or are you just trying to show me exactly that you did all this math?
Mm-hmm.
And how much of that conflicts with trying to give something to the public that doesn't need to be, it doesn't need an interpreter. It can be looked at and just guided as, almost like to the first part of the book where this like kind of gatekeeping this knowledge is, it's behind a paywall. And then when it's behind a paywall, you probably need some kind of course or background in order to understand a lot of this. It's like the original piece of science, as you mentioned earlier on in the episode, was this should be accessible to all. And it's like, even when they gain access via paying, they're essentially, almost made to feel stupid because they don't quite understand some of these numbers. So it's not accessible anymore, either via a traditional intellect or, I guess, schooling kind of knowledge versus just having the money to pay for it. So there's almost like a double paywall in a sense for people to kind of grasp and attain this knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's tough. It's like easy to confuse people with a lot of numbers, and then at the end, especially if like you're hearing it from like a quote unquote like authority figure. They kind of have
Mm-hmm.
like that halo effect. And it's like, ah, shit, like I don't understand that, but sounds smart, so this person must be right.
Mm-hmm.
When maybe, but like maybe not. And I think a lot of times people like to. I've said this before, but like you always like, should be a little wary of people who speak in absolutes about things. Like I feel like true quote unquote experts don't usually speak like if you actually know something thoroughly. It's not always going to be. It shouldn't just be black and white. It should be like a most of the times like there are these general principles that these are generally how things go. Not. And he talks about this a little bit of like the inductive versus deductive reasoning. One's like, it's like the bottom up approach with inductive reasoning, where it's like, okay, you make observations, you try to observe like patterns, and then you can kind of come up with general theories about how things work. And it's based on more probabilities versus, absolute certainty versus like the deductive reasoning. It's more of that top down approach where it's like you're drawing more specific conclusions based on known principles. And it's like if those are true, the conclusion is guaranteed to be 100% true. Not to say that either one is good or bad, but a lot of times like things are more gray than they are so black and white. And I think our brains tend to think about, we want to think black and white because it's just easier to think about like, okay, yes or no, binary versus like nuanced. It's just kind of like mental shortcuts that we like to take. And he wrote chapter 10 was all about uncertainty, and he kind of like just made the big point overall of like we shouldn't be afraid of like uncertainty because it was a good quote. He said like the world is much more strange than we think. Like things are a lot more uncertain. And he talked about like a physics principle that I think relates really well just to life in general. It was called Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. It states like the more precisely we're able to measure a position of a particle, the less precisely we can know its momentum. And it's like we can never know everything with certainty, right? The world is much more strange than we think, but oftentimes we demand very like rigidly defined areas of doubt and uncertainty instead of just accepting that like, hey, like there's nuances to like all this stuff, and you can never be too certain about some things. And obviously that's easier said than done because I think as we go through our careers and like learn more, we want to be able to like think we're a little bit more certain on things. And I think generally that's a good like rule of thumb, but it's also kind of like relieving that you don't have to feel like like you don't have to feel like you know everything, and you can always like still keep searching. And like at the end of the day, you can like read and learn as much as you want. There's still going to be things that you're like a little uncertain about, and that's kind of like the point that he makes is like we shouldn't like avoid uncertainty. We should kind of explore it. And that's how he said like statistics should be used. Statistics is more of like a tool that we can use to explore uncertainty, not to completely eliminate it and feel like we have everything figured out. So I don't know. Overall, I feel like this book was pretty good. I think a little bit of it went a little over my head, but I think it was good to kind of dive into like a topic that was like a little bit outside of, I feel like, both at least my comfort zone. I don't know if you felt the same way. Like I said, like the first part was like really interesting. It was kind of like that rebel view to science and all that stuff, and then he kind of got into more of like the newer, grittier details. Um, but I think you can draw a lot of conclusions back to coaching too. I mean, he mentions the part I like too is he's done a fair amount of coaching, and a point he makes is like coaches figure out what works in training, and then scientists come in and explain why it works. So I think you need a little bit of both. Like it's good to have the hands-on stuff and like just tinker and see what works, in real life, but then also like reading research and kind of like doing your own research of figuring out like why it works. Like, this worked, I don't know why. Investigate, see if there's any research that's already published on the topic. And if not, kind of like do your own research into why you think it might have worked and kind of reverse engineer from there. So
I think it definitely was above some of my pay grade with what he was talking about, particularly in part two when he's bringing up like Popper's principle or things like that. It's like maybe I got to look this up outside of the book. But it was fun to kind of get outside of our zone a little bit. It's not a training manual, and it's not a. It is, but it isn't really one of those like a pop sci kind of thought books. And it's not finance, so like you kind of like stepping into academia where we kind of. I don't want to say we kind of do our let's keep our distance of like be academic in a sense, but not like dive too deep into that side of things. So it for sure kind of like rattles you a little bit, but it was a good read. I think there's a little bit, if we kind of give not just the positives but the negatives, like we kind of get a little bit too into the weeds at points, which I think is necessary. But at some certain point, like you may like kind of lose your interest or kind of start to drift away from the book a little bit. I know I did a little bit myself when we first started reading, and I was like, okay, there's some points to this where it's like you kind of have to trudge through that to get to the next piece. So overall, I would say it's a good book. It's definitely worth a read. I think the book's based on skepticism, so going into it with a little bit of skepticism is probably good. And just like Cleather would probably say, like, don't trust his word as gospel.
Yeah, I think overall it was solid. Definitely out of my comfort zone, so it was good to kind of read something where it was like I liked a lot of the concepts, but I also didn't like feel like, oh, like, yeah, this is like I didn't feel good in the sense that like, oh, I like understand everything, which means that maybe I need to read it again, or just kind of like you said, like he referenced a lot of other things that you could look into outside the book, so I have to do some digging into that as well. Alrighty, folks. Well, probably do another one of these Bev Boys book clubs episode in the next 6 to 8 weeks. So in the next month or two, be on the lookout for our 5th installment. As always, check us out on Instagram, bevboys.tv, bevboys.com if you want to support the boys with some merch. We've already reviewed both these drinks. We're big fans of both OG Monster, Bum Energy. And yeah, we will catch you guys in the next episode. Peace.